I was part of a group of hikers who had planned a challenging trek deep into the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest. We were all experienced, or at least we liked to think so, each with multiple hikes under our belts and a respectable collection of gear. It was late autumn, and the days were growing shorter. By the time we set off in the early morning, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the towering pines that stretched endlessly above us. There was a cold wind rustling through the branches, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest felt both alive and ancient, like a place untouched by time. The trail we chose was known for its difficulty, winding through dense undergrowth, rocky outcrops, and steep inclines. We had underestimated the rapid change in weather, though. The forecast had predicted clear skies, but as the hours passed, the clouds gathered, and the temperature dropped noticeably. We pressed on, determined to reach the ridge before dusk, but the daylight was fading faster than we expected. The trees seemed to close in around us, their dark silhouettes merging with the thickening gloom. Mark was the first to notice something was wrong. We had been following the trail markers without issue for most of the day, but now, they were becoming sparse and harder to spot. The familiar bright orange blazes on the trees were fewer and farther between, and some looked faded or partially covered by moss. Mark stopped and scanned the area, his brow furrowed in concern. "Guys, I think we might be off course," he said quietly. The group slowed, eyes darting nervously through the dim light. There was a heaviness settling over us, a creeping unease that we couldn't shake. As the sky darkened, Mark suddenly froze, his head turning sharply toward the deeper forest. From somewhere far off, an eerie howl echoed through the trees. It was long and haunting, not quite like any animal we had heard before. The sound seemed to vibrate in the air, bouncing off the trunks and fading into silence. A chill ran down my spine. The howl was a reminder that we were not in a tame place. This was wilderness, wild and unpredictable, and it didn't care for us or our plans. We gathered closer together, trying to keep our spirits up, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest no longer felt like an adventurous playground. It felt vast and unknowable, a place where we were just small, fragile intruders. The wind picked up, rustling the branches with a sharp, whispering sound, and the cold seemed to seep into our bones. We realized then that the day was ending much sooner than we had prepared for. Our phones were beginning to lose battery, and the signal was already spotty, flickering in and out as though the forest itself was swallowing our connection to the outside world. Mark suggested we retrace our steps to find the last clear marker. We moved cautiously, eyes peeled for anything that might guide us back. The undergrowth was thick, and the path was slippery with wet leaves. The trail, once evident, was now obscured, and the fading light made it nearly impossible to distinguish safe footing from hidden roots or loose stones. Every crack of a twig or rustle in the brush made us jump, the tension mounting with each step. I kept thinking about the howl. What creature could make such a sound? It wasn't like the typical calls of wolves or coyotes I was used to hearing on previous hikes. This howl was deeper, more resonant, almost mournful. Sometimes it felt closer, as if something was moving just beyond the trees, watching us. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of birdsong and insects absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Despite our experience, we were unprepared for how quickly conditions deteriorated. The cold wind was relentless, cutting through our jackets and chilling us to the core. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and the first stars were beginning to blink into existence. Our headlamps sat in our packs, saved for emergencies, but the growing darkness made it clear we might need them soon. The trail markers remained elusive, and every path we took seemed to circle us back to where we started or lead us deeper into the forest's shadowy maze. Mark's voice broke the silence. "We should set up camp here for the night," he said, his tone steady but carrying an edge of urgency. The group nodded in agreement, relief evident in our expressions. We began looking for a flat spot, something sheltered from the wind and safe from any sudden wildlife encounters. The ground was damp and uneven, littered with pine needles and fallen branches. As we worked quickly to pitch our tents, the eerie howl returned, closer this time, sending a fresh wave of unease through the group. I remember standing by the edge of the clearing, watching the dark shapes of the trees sway against the sky. The howl echoed again, long and haunting, and I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks, too quick to identify. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just a deer or some other forest creature, but the sound, the atmosphere, it all spoke of something else. We lit a small fire, struggling against the dampness and the cold. The flames cast flickering light on our faces, creating dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the restless forest around us. The warmth was comforting, but the firelight was fragile, a fragile barrier against the dark unknown pressing in. We spoke less now, each of us lost in our own thoughts, ears straining for any unusual sounds. The wind howled through the branches overhead, a mournful symphony that matched the unease knotting my stomach. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again. But nothing appeared, only the endless forest, silent except for the wind and the distant echoes of that haunting howl. Somewhere deep inside, a warning flickered, a primal sense of danger that urged caution and vigilance. The night was only beginning, and I knew this was far from over. The forest held its secrets tight, and we were just visitors, lost in its vast, cold embrace. By the time dawn was just a faint promise on the horizon, the fog had rolled in thick and fast. It crept through the trees like a living thing, swallowing the forest in a cold, damp embrace. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing. We could barely see more than a few feet ahead, and the familiar shapes of the trees turned into ghostly silhouettes that shifted and swayed in the mist. The comforting warmth of the fire from the night before had long since faded, leaving us chilled and uncertain. We knew we couldn't stay put much longer. Our phones were dead or useless, swallowed by the dense canopy and the thick fog. The trail markers we had relied on the day before were nowhere to be seen, hidden beneath layers of moisture or obscured by the shifting gray. The cold seemed to seep into every bone, making our fingers stiff and our movements sluggish. The forest around us felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. Mark took the lead. His voice was steady but low, trying to keep the group focused and moving. "Let's head back the way we came," he suggested, though no one was sure which way that was anymore. We moved slowly, hands outstretched to touch the trees as we went, hoping the familiar rough bark might guide us. But the forest had changed overnight. The path was muddier, the undergrowth thicker, and the fog made every step feel like a leap into the unknown. Sarah, one of the quieter members of our group, suddenly stopped and knelt down, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Look at this," she whispered. Near her boots were a series of footprints unlike anything we had seen before. They were large, elongated, and the shape didn't match any animal tracks we knew. No deer, no bear, not even a large bird. The prints were oddly spaced, too big for a human, and the deep impressions suggested something heavy had passed through recently. Instead of calling the others over, Sarah crept forward, following the tracks quietly and with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. She moved slowly, hope flickering in her eyes that these prints might lead us out of the endless fog. But as she went further, her figure began to blur and fade into the gray veil. I called after her, but my voice barely carried. The others hesitated, torn between following her and staying together. Eventually, Sarah disappeared completely from sight, swallowed by the mist. Panic started to rise in the group like a tide. We shouted for Sarah, our voices echoing helplessly through the fog, but there was no answer. The silence that followed was heavier than the fog itself. We were now not only lost, but separated. The forest no longer felt like a place we could navigate. It had become a labyrinth where every step could lead us deeper into the unknown. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that Sarah was experienced and would find her way back. But the fear gnawed at me relentlessly. Our breaths came out in sharp puffs, visible in the cold air, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. The fog muffled sounds, turning them into strange, distorted echoes that seemed to come from all directions at once. The cold was unrelenting, and the dampness clung to our clothes and skin, making us shiver uncontrollably. Our hands and feet felt numb, and the thick fog played tricks on our senses. Shadows moved at the edges of our vision, shapes that dissolved when we turned to look. Trees appeared closer or farther away than they actually were. The forest seemed to close in around us, a silent, watchful presence that made the air feel suffocating. As the morning stretched on, the group huddled together, trying to stay warm and focused. Mark was visibly tense, his usual confident demeanor replaced by tight lines around his eyes. We debated whether to stay put and wait for the fog to lift or to keep moving, hoping to stumble upon a recognizable landmark or a clearer path. Neither option felt safe. Staying meant risking hypothermia and exhaustion. Moving meant risking getting even more lost or running into something unknown. Hours passed in this limbo, the fog thick and unyielding. Then, just as despair threatened to overwhelm us, Sarah reappeared. She was soaked and shivering but unharmed. She explained that she had followed the footprints for a while, hoping they would lead to a trail or some sign of human presence. Instead, she found herself in a small clearing with no obvious exit, surrounded by trees that seemed older and more twisted than the rest. The footprints ended there, as if the creature that made them had vanished into thin air. Her discovery deepened the mystery and fear. If something had been moving through the forest that none of us could identify, what else was out there watching us? Sarah's encounter, though brief and unexplained, was a stark reminder that we were not alone in this place. The forest was home to secrets far older and stranger than any of us had imagined. The day wore on, and the fog began to thin slightly, revealing glimpses of the rugged terrain around us, steep slopes, rocky outcrops, and dense thickets. But the trail remained elusive, and our sense of direction was fractured. We tried to use the sun's position to guide us, but the low light and the thick canopy made it difficult. The cold continued to bite, and our energy was draining fast. Despite the fear and confusion, we forced ourselves to keep moving, sticking close together and speaking in low voices. Every so often, we stopped to rest and scan the surrounding trees for any sign of the elusive trail markers. But they were gone, hidden or erased by the relentless weather and time. As night approached again, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The eerie howl from the previous night returned, this time closer and more persistent. It sent a fresh wave of terror through us. The wind picked up, rattling the branches and carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. We reached a small clearing and decided to set up camp once more, our hands trembling as we fumbled with the tents and gear. The fire was harder to start in the damp conditions, and the smoke seemed to hang low in the cold air, swirling around us like a ghostly veil. We huddled close, sharing what little warmth we could, eyes constantly scanning the dark forest beyond the firelight. The forest seemed to pulse with unseen life. Branches snapped in the distance, low growls echoed through the trees, and shadows flickered just beyond the fire's glow. Mark spotted a shadowy figure watching us from the edge of the clearing, a shape that vanished whenever he tried to focus on it. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Fear settled in our bones. We realized that whatever was out there, it was patient, watching, waiting. The forest was no longer just a place of natural beauty and challenge. It had become a living nightmare where every sound and shadow held a threat. We debated whether to wait for morning or try to move in the dark, caught between the dangers of the unknown and the will to survive. The night deepened, and the forest closed in around us, a cold, silent reminder that we were not in control here. The night was colder than any of us expected. The dampness in the air clung to our clothes and skin, chilling us to the bone despite the small fire flickering weakly before us. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, tightened the knot of fear in my stomach. The forest around us felt alive in a way that was anything but comforting, as if unseen eyes were tracking our every movement, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. Mark tried to keep the group calm, his voice steady but low. "We'll stay together and keep watching shifts," he said, though even he didn't sound fully convinced. We pitched our tents as best we could on the uneven, damp ground, but the wind kept tearing at the tarps, making the effort feel futile. The fire was a feeble barrier against the dark, and every time the flames flickered or dipped low, the shadows seemed to stretch and creep closer. As the hours passed, strange noises surrounded us. The sharp crack of branches breaking, low growls that vibrated through the forest floor, and the occasional sound of heavy footsteps that didn't quite match any animal we knew. My breath caught in my throat more than once when a sudden noise pierced the silence, only to reveal nothing but the swaying trees and the thick darkness beyond the firelight. Mark was the first to spot it. A shadowy figure, tall and indistinct, lingered just beyond the edge of our clearing. It appeared for a moment, watching us silently, its form blending with the trees and the mist. Each time Mark raised his flashlight to focus on the figure, it vanished, melting back into the forest as if it were never there. The sight sent a ripple of panic through the group. If something was out there, it was smart, patient, and aware of us. The fire sputtered as the wind kicked up, sparks flying into the sky, and the cold seemed to press in tighter. We debated whether to try moving again under the cover of darkness or to wait for daylight. Both options felt perilous. Moving meant risking missteps or surprise encounters in the pitch-black forest. Staying meant enduring the cold and the unknown presence circling us. We settled on keeping watch, rotating in pairs so no one would be left alone for too long. I volunteered for the first shift, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. The beam cut narrow slices through the blackness, illuminating the trees in ghostly pools of light. Every shadow seemed to twitch and shift, and the howls from the previous nights echoed faintly on the wind, distant yet haunting. During my watch, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows flitting between the trees, too quick and silent for any animal I knew. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I tried to convince myself it was just the play of light and wind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The forest felt like a trap, a place where time slowed and the rules of the natural world no longer applied. The others were restless in their tents, whispering in low tones, sharing stories to keep the fear at bay. Sarah, who had followed those strange footprints earlier, was pale and quiet, eyes wide every time the wind shifted. She kept glancing outside, as if expecting the shadowy figure to return. Mark paced near the fire, hands clenched, scanning the darkness with a wary gaze. Suddenly, a loud snap shattered the fragile calm, a branch breaking close by, followed by a low growl that seemed to come from just beyond the fire's reach. We all froze, hearts pounding. The firelight wavered as a gust of wind swept through, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I saw eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, reflecting the fire's orange glow. The group instinctively huddled closer, whispering urgent plans. We debated making noise to scare off whatever was out there, but the idea of drawing attention to ourselves felt reckless. The forest held its breath, the silence pressing in heavier than ever. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, like invisible hands brushing against our skin. Mark leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here all night. We need to find higher ground, somewhere safer." The problem was, none of us knew which direction to go. The fog had lifted only slightly, and the darkness obscured every landmark. Our phones were dead, and the compass kept spinning erratically, as if the forest itself was interfering. Packing up in the dark was slow and nerve-wracking. Every noise seemed amplified. The rustle of a tent flap, the clink of gear, the crunch of leaves underfoot. We moved cautiously, flashlights sweeping the trees, alert for any sign of the figure or strange sounds. It felt like the forest was watching our every step, waiting to see what we would do next. As we climbed, the terrain grew steeper and more treacherous. Rocks slick with moss and wet leaves threatened to send us tumbling with every step. The cold bit harder, and the wind howled through the trees like a mournful spirit. Our breaths came in ragged puffs, the air thin and sharp in our lungs. Suddenly, from somewhere behind us, a chorus of low growls erupted, rising and falling like a dark chant. The sounds were too coordinated to be random animal noises. They were something else, something deliberate. A shiver ran through the group as we quickened our pace, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and adrenaline. We finally reached a small plateau, a patch of rocky ground that gave us a better view of the valley below, though mist still clung to the trees like a ghostly blanket. The wind was relentless here, but at least we could see farther. The fire we lit was small, but the flickering flames gave us a fragile sense of security. The shadowy figure never appeared again, but the feeling of being watched never left. Branches snapped at the edges of the clearing, and low growls echoed far below. The forest seemed to pulse with life, but not the kind of life we understood or trusted. We debated our next move, exhausted and on edge. Staying put felt like inviting danger, but moving without a clear path risked getting lost forever. The forest was a living entity, ancient and indifferent, and we were just intruders caught in its grip. That night, as we huddled around the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were closing in on us. The darkness was thick and endless, hiding secrets we were never meant to uncover. Every shadow held a threat, every sound was a warning. And somewhere out there, beyond the firelight, something was waiting. Lisa had set out on what she thought would be a quick overnight trip in the Canadian Rockies, eager to escape the noise of the city and lose herself in the wilderness for a little while. She was experienced, confident in her navigation skills, and well prepared with gear, maps, and a sturdy backpack. But as dusk settled, she realized something was wrong. The trail markers she'd been following vanished abruptly, and to make matters worse, her map was soaked through from a sudden rain shower, the ink running and smudging beyond recognition. Her heart sank as she fumbled with the ruined map, trying to piece together her route, but the wet paper was useless now. The forest around her was thick and closing in. The path was no more than a faint suggestion beneath fallen leaves and branches. She called out softly, hoping for a response from any nearby hikers, but all she heard in return was the rustling of wind through the trees and the distant cry of a lone bird. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows grew longer, swallowing the trail. The temperature dropped quickly, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Lisa knew she needed shelter, somewhere safe to wait out the night and regroup come morning. As she pushed through a dense thicket, she stumbled upon something unexpected, an old ranger's cabin, half hidden among the trees, its weathered wooden walls stained by years of rain and sun. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges with the slightest breeze. Inside, the small cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Dust motes floated in the fading light that filtered through grimy windows. Lisa's footsteps echoed softly as she moved about, grateful for the shelter. On a rickety table lay a worn leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle. Curiosity and a flicker of unease made her open it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, scrawled in haste. The words spoke of another lost hiker, a man named James, who had found himself trapped in the forest years before. His writing detailed days of wandering, growing cold and hungry, haunted by strange noises and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures. He described an overwhelming feeling of being watched, the forest itself seeming to turn against him. The last entry was hurried and nearly illegible, ending with a chilling warning. They are close. If you find this, do not trust the silence. Do not look outside. Lisa's breath caught. The words echoed too closely the fear she had been feeling all evening. Was it possible that others had come before her and never returned? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She closed the journal carefully and looked out the window. The forest outside was dark, the trees standing like silent sentinels against the fading light. Suddenly, a sound broke the quiet, a series of footsteps approaching the cabin. Lisa's heart pounded, throat tightening. She moved to the door slowly, peering through the narrow crack, expecting to see another lost hiker or perhaps a ranger. But there was nothing. Only the empty wilderness stretched out before her, the trees swaying gently in the cold breeze. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if unseen eyes were tracking her every move. Lisa stepped back, locking the door as best she could with a rickety latch. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge but a trap, a small island of safety surrounded by an indifferent and watchful forest. She sat down, clutching the journal, trying to steady her breathing. Outside, the footsteps returned briefly, circling the cabin in an eerie rhythm before fading into silence. The wind whispered through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible murmur that sent goosebumps racing across her skin. Lisa's mind raced with questions and fear. Was she truly alone out here, or was something else lurking just beyond the thin walls? The journal's warnings seemed less like stories and more like desperate messages to anyone who might follow. As night deepened, the forest around the cabin seemed to close in, the darkness thick and suffocating. The footsteps never truly stopped, and the feeling of unseen presence grew heavier. Lisa knew she couldn't stay here forever. She had to find a way out, But with the map ruined and the forest hiding its secrets, every step forward was a step into the unknown. Two brothers, Jake and Ryan, found themselves stranded in the unforgiving deserts of Arizona after their ATV broke down miles from the nearest road. What was supposed to be a weekend adventure quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. The blistering heat of the day gave way to freezing cold nights, and their water supply dwindled alarmingly fast. Every landmark blurred in the endless expanse of sand and rock, and the relentless sun left them disoriented and weak. As days passed, the desert played cruel tricks on their minds. Mirages shimmered on the horizon, glimmering lakes and distant towns that vanished the moment they tried to approach. The heat distorted their senses, making it impossible to trust what they saw or felt. Exhaustion and thirst gnawed at their resolve, but they pressed on, hoping to find a way back to civilization. One night, as they huddled beneath a sparse Joshua tree, the brothers noticed flickering lights in the distance, far beyond the hills. At first, they thought it might be a rescue team or passing vehicles, but the lights were intermittent, dancing in patterns that made no sense. When they tried to move toward the glow, the lights vanished, leaving only darkness and silence behind. The eerie lights returned over the next few nights, always just out of reach. Along with them came strange whispers carried on the dry wind, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to circle around the brothers, never quite close, but never far away. The whispers chilled them more than the cold desert nights, hinting at something beyond explanation. Despite their dire situation, Jake and Ryan managed to ration their remaining water and share what little food they had left. They used the stars to navigate, but the desert's vastness swallowed their attempts to find a clear path. Every direction looked the same, endless dunes and rocky outcrops under the vast sky. When rescuers finally found them, weak and dehydrated but alive, the brothers were relieved beyond words. Yet, neither could explain what they had seen or heard during those long nights. The flickering lights and the whispers remained a mystery, a haunting reminder that the desert held secrets beyond human understanding. Their story spread through local communities, sparking countless theories and cautionary tales about the desert's hidden dangers. It served as a stark reminder of nature's unforgiving power and the thin line between survival and disappearance in the wild. The brothers' experience, alongside the other tales of lost hikers and eerie encounters, became the foundation for a popular adventure podcast that delved deep into true wilderness mysteries. Listeners were invited to explore these stories, to question the unknown, and to respect the wild places that challenge us in ways we cannot always explain.